On the morning of her 18th birthday, Aisha Carter received two things: a garbage bag containing everything she owned and $250 in crumpled bills. The foster care system had no use for adults. By noon, she was standing on the sidewalk watching the only door she had ever known close behind her. 3 weeks later, she would buy a rusted Quonset hut in the middle of nowhere for $5. The whole town called her crazy. They said she would not survive the coming winter. They had no idea what was buried beneath that land or who wanted it back. The social worker did not knock. She never did. The door swung open at exactly 7 in the morning, and Mrs. Patterson stood there with a clipboard and a garbage bag, her face carrying the same tired expression she wore every time a kid aged out of the system. "Happy birthday, Aisha," she said, though her voice held no warmth. "You have 2 hours to pack." Aisha had known this day was coming. She had counted down the weeks, the days, the hours, but knowing something and living it were two different things. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the garbage bag Mrs. Patterson dropped on the floor. 15 years in foster care, 7 different homes, and this was what it all came down to: a plastic bag and a deadline. She packed quickly. There was not much to take. A few clothes, a toothbrush, a worn paperback novel she had read so many times the spine had cracked. No photographs, no keepsakes, nothing that proved she had ever belonged anywhere. At the front office, they handed her an envelope containing $250 in cash. Transition assistance, they called it. Aisha called it a joke. $250 would not even cover a month's rent in the cheapest motel in town. "You'll need to pick up your forwarded mail at the post office," Mrs. Patterson said, sliding a form across the counter. "Standard procedure. Sign here." Aisha signed. She had spent her whole life signing forms other people put in front of her: consent forms, transfer forms, release forms, each one a reminder that she had no control over her own existence. By noon, she was standing on the sidewalk outside the facility, the garbage bag slung over her shoulder. The door clicked shut behind her, and just like that, she was no longer the system's problem. She was nobody's problem. She was just nobody. The October wind cut through her thin jacket as she walked toward the bus stop. She had no plan, no family to call, no friends with spare couches. The $250 in her pocket felt like a timer counting down to disaster. The post office was a small brick building 3 blocks from the bus station. Aisha went inside, handed over her ID, and waited while a clerk disappeared into the back room. He returned with a stack of envelopes held together by a rubber band, mostly junk. Credit card offers addressed to current resident. Flyers for pizza places she would never be able to afford. But at the bottom of the stack there was something different. A thick envelope made of cream-colored paper, the kind that felt expensive. The return address read, "Morrison and Keller Attorneys at Law." Aisha turned it over in her hands. She had never received a letter from a lawyer before. For a moment, she wondered if she was in some kind of trouble. Maybe one of her former foster parents was suing her for something. Maybe the system had made a mistake with her paperwork. She tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The words made no sense at first. She read them once then, twice, then a third time. According to the letter, a woman named Eleanor Whitmore had died 6 months ago and left behind a will. In that will, Eleanor Whitmore had named Aisha Carter as the sole beneficiary of a parcel of land located in rural Harwick County. Aisha had never heard of Eleanor Whitmore. She had never been to Harwick County. She did not understand why a dead stranger would leave her anything at all. The letter continued with conditions. To claim the inheritance, Aisha would need to pay a transfer fee of $5 and take up residence on the property within 30 days. If she failed to meet these conditions, the inheritance would be voided and the land would revert to the state. $5 for a piece of land. It sounded like a scam. It had to be a scam. But Aisha had nothing to lose. She had $250, no home, and no future. If this was a trick, at least it was something to do. The law office of Morrison and Keller occupied the second floor of a building that smelled like old paper and cigarette smoke. The receptionist looked at Aisha like she had wandered into the wrong place, but led her to a back office where an elderly man sat behind a desk covered in files. "Miss Carter," the lawyer said. His name was Morrison, and he did not offer to shake her hand. "I was wondering when you would show up." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photographs of the property. Aisha stared at them, her stomach sinking. The land was a patch of overgrown forest with no visible road access. In the center of it stood a Quonset hut, a half-cylinder structure made of corrugated steel, rusted and sagging and covered in vines. There was no electricity, no running water, no indication that anyone had set foot there in decades. "This is it?" Aisha asked. "This is it?" Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Whitmore was an eccentric woman. She owned this parcel for many years but never developed it. Frankly, Miss Carter, I would advise you to sell." Aisha looked up. "Sell. There is a buyer interested in the property. They are prepared to offer $3,000 cash. Given the condition of the land, that is a generous offer. $3,000. The number echoed in Aisha's mind. $3,000 would mean a security deposit on an apartment, first and last month's rent, a chance to start over without sleeping on the street. But something about the way Morrison said it made her hesitate. He was too eager. His eyes kept darting to the folder, then back to her face, watching her reaction. If the land was worthless, why did someone want to buy it? If the Quonset hut was just a pile of rust, why was there a buyer waiting in the wings before she even knew the place existed? "Who is the buyer?" Aisha asked. Morrison's expression flickered. "A development company. They have interests in the area." "What kind of interests?" "That is not relevant to your decision, Miss Carter." His voice had turned cold. "I am simply advising you that selling would be the practical choice. A young woman in your situation has no business trying to live in the middle of nowhere with no resources." "A young woman in your situation." Aisha had heard variations of that phrase her entire life. People telling her what she could not do. People deciding what was best for her without asking what she wanted. She looked at the photographs again. The rusted steel, the overgrown trees, the absolute isolation. It was the ugliest, most hopeless thing she had ever seen. But it was hers. For the first time in 18 years, something in this world had her name on it. "I am not selling," she said. Morrison stared at her. "Excuse me, I said I am not selling." Aisha reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. She placed it on the desk between them. "I am claiming the inheritance. Where do I sign?" The lawyer's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, irritation, something that almost looked like fear. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. Finally, he pulled a document from the folder and pushed it toward her. "Sign here," he said quietly. "And here, and initial at the bottom." Aisha signed. The pen felt heavy in her hand, like she was writing something permanent into the fabric of the universe. When she finished, Morrison gathered the papers without looking at her. His jaw was tight, his movements stiff. "The deed will be processed within the week," he said. "I hope you know what you are doing, Miss Carter." Aisha stood up and slung her garbage bag over her shoulder. "So do I," she said. She walked out of the office and into the gray afternoon light. The wind was still cold and she still had nowhere to sleep tonight. But for the first time in her life, she had something that belonged to her. A piece of land in the middle of nowhere. A rusted Quonset hut that everyone said was worthless. She did not know why Eleanor Whitmore had chosen her. She did not know what was waiting for her in Harwick County. But she was going to find out. The bus dropped Aisha at the edge of a dirt road 8 miles outside the nearest town. From there, she walked. The October air was cold and damp, and the path grew narrower with every step until it disappeared entirely into a tangle of brush and fallen branches. By the time she found the property, her shoes were soaked through and her legs ached from climbing over roots and rocks. The Quonset hut looked worse in person than it had in the photographs. The corrugated steel was orange with rust, and half the windows had been shattered by storms or vandals. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and when Aisha pushed it open, she was hit by the smell of mold and rotting leaves. The floor was dirt-covered in debris. The ceiling had holes where rain had eaten through the metal. She stood in the doorway for a long time, her garbage bag hanging from her shoulder, trying to convince herself that this was better than sleeping under a bridge. That first night was the longest of her life. She had no blankets, no fire, no light, except the pale glow of the moon through the broken windows. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and strange sounds echoed from the forest outside. She curled up in the corner with her jacket pulled over her head and told herself that she had survived worse. She was not sure if it was true. By the end of the first week, Aisha had learned things she never thought she would need to know. She learned how to collect water from the stream a quarter-mile away and carry it back in an old bucket she found rusted behind the hut. She learned how to gather dry wood and build a fire that would last through the night. She learned how to patch the holes in the roof with plastic bags and duct tape she bought with the last of her money. She also learned that the people in town wanted nothing to do with her. The first time she walked into the general store to buy supplies, the owner looked at her like she was a stray dog that had wandered in from the street. He was a heavy-set man with a red face, and he stood behind the counter with his arms crossed. "We do not serve your kind here," he said. Aisha felt the words like a slap. She had experienced prejudice before, but there was something different about this, something more personal. The man was not just looking at her skin. He was looking at her like he knew exactly who she was and where she lived. She left without buying anything. On the walk back to the Quonset hut, a pickup truck full of young men slowed down beside her. They hung out the windows, shouting things she tried not to hear. One of them threw an empty beer can at her feet. "Go back where you came from," someone yelled. Aisha kept walking. She did not look back. A few days later, she woke up to find a bag sitting on the ground outside her door. Inside was food: canned beans, crackers, a jar of peanut butter. There was also a wool blanket, old and worn, but clean. She looked around, but there was no one in sight. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying in the wind. It happened again 3 days later. Another bag, more food, a pair of thick socks. On the third time, Aisha was ready. She hid behind a tree near the edge of the property and waited. Just before dawn, a figure emerged from the woods. It was an old woman, white-haired and stooped, carrying a canvas bag. She moved slowly but deliberately, placing the bag by the door the same way she must have done before. Aisha stepped out from her hiding spot. "Who are you?" The old woman turned. Her face was weathered and lined, and her eyes held something Aisha could not read. Fear, maybe, or sadness. "You should not be here," the woman said. Her voice was thin and cracked. "Why not? This is my land." The woman shook her head slowly. "You do not understand what you have walked into." Before Aisha could ask what she meant, the woman turned and disappeared back into the trees. Aisha tried to follow, but the old woman knew the forest better than she did. Within minutes, she was gone. 2 weeks passed. The weather grew colder, and Aisha began to feel like she might actually survive until spring. She had established a routine: water in the morning, firewood in the afternoon, repairs whenever she could. The Quonset hut was still a wreck, but it was starting to feel like something she could live in. Then the black car arrived. Aisha heard it before she saw it, the rumble of an expensive engine completely out of place on the rough dirt path. She stepped outside and watched as a sleek sedan rolled to a stop in front of her property. The driver's door opened, and a man in a gray suit stepped out. He was not from around here, that much was obvious. His shoes were polished, His hair was perfectly styled, and he carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than everything Aisha owned. "Miss Carter," he said, flashing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "My name is Bradley Shaw. I represent Whitmore Holdings. May I have a moment of your time?" Aisha crossed her arms. "What do you want?" Shaw glanced at the Quonset hut, his expression carefully neutral. "I understand you recently acquired this property. My clients are interested in purchasing it from you." "It is not for sale." "Perhaps you should hear our offer first." Shaw opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Whitmore Holdings is prepared to pay you $50,000 for the land. Cash. No conditions." $50,000. The number hit Aisha like a physical force. $50,000 was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was enough to rent an apartment for years, enough to go to school, enough to build a real future. But something was wrong. She could feel it in the way Shaw was watching her, the way his smile stayed frozen on his face. Morrison had offered $3,000. Now this man was offering $50,000 for a rusted hut on a patch of overgrown forest. "Why?" Aisha asked. Shaw blinked. "I am sorry. Why do you want this land so badly? You people have been trying to buy it since before I even knew it existed." "We have interests in the region," Shaw said smoothly. "Environmental conservation, sustainable development. This parcel would fit nicely into our long-term plans." He was lying. Aisha could see it in his eyes, hear it in the practiced cadence of his voice. He had rehearsed this speech probably dozens of times for situations exactly like this. "I am not selling," she said. Shaw's smile flickered. "Miss Carter, I urge you to reconsider. A young woman living alone in conditions like these, it is not safe. Anything could happen out here." "Is that a threat?" "It is a reality." Shaw tucked the folder back into his briefcase and snapped it shut. "You have my card. When you change your mind, and you will give me a call." He got back into his car and drove away. Aisha watched until the sedan disappeared around a bend in the road. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From anger. They thought they could scare her. They thought she would take their money and disappear like a good little orphan. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The attack started 3 days later. Someone dumped motor oil into the stream where Aisha collected her water. She woke up one morning to find rocks had been thrown through 2 of her remaining windows. A letter arrived in her mailbox, which she had not even known she had, demanding that she submit to a safety inspection within 14 days or face forced removal from the property. The townspeople, who had already been cold, became openly hostile. The general store put up a sign that said, "No trespassing," whenever she approached. People crossed the street to avoid her. Children pointed and whispered. Aisha understood now. This was not just a company trying to buy her land. This was an entire system trying to crush her. Whitmore Holdings had money and power, and they were using both to make her life impossible. She thought about giving up. Every night, lying on the cold floor of the Quonset hut, she thought about walking away, taking whatever offer they gave her and starting over somewhere else. She had done it before. She could do it again. But every morning she woke up and looked at the walls she had patched, the fire pit she had built, the life she was carving out of nothing. And she stayed. The storm came on a Thursday night. Rain hammered against the steel roof like gunfire, and the wind shook the walls so hard Aisha thought the whole structure might collapse. She huddled in the corner, wrapped in the wool blanket the old woman had given her, watching water leak through the holes she had not been able to patch. She was about to lose everything. She could feel it in her bones. Whatever game she was playing, she was losing. Then someone knocked on the door. Aisha's heart stopped. No one knocked on her door. No one came here except people who wanted to hurt her. She grabbed the makeshift weapon she kept by her bed, a length of pipe she had found in the woods, and approached the door slowly. "Who is it?" "My name is Mabel Thornton." The voice was old and tired, nearly drowned out by the rain. "I have been watching you. I think it is time we talked." Aisha opened the door. The old woman from before stood on her doorstep, soaked to the bone, her white hair plastered to her skull. She looked exhausted and afraid, but her eyes were clear. "May I come in?" Aisha stepped aside. Mabel entered, dripping water onto the dirt floor, and looked around at the patched walls and the meager fire. "You have done well," she said. "Better than I expected." "Why are you here?" Aisha asked. Mabel lowered herself onto an overturned crate that served as Aisha's only chair. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she looked up at Aisha with an expression that held decades of regret. "I knew Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "I worked for her family for 40 years. I was there when everything happened." Aisha felt her chest tighten. "What do you mean, everything?" "I knew your mother, Aisha. Her name was Lorraine Carter. She worked in Eleanor's house just like I did." The world tilted. Aisha reached out to steady herself against the wall. Her mother. Someone who knew her mother. "She was a good woman," Mabel continued. "Kind, hardworking. Eleanor loved her like a daughter." The old woman's voice cracked. "But then Lorraine got pregnant, and everything fell apart." "What happened to her?" Mabel shook her head. "I cannot tell you everything, not yet. They are watching. They have always been watching." She stood up, her joints creaking. "But I wanted you to know that you are not alone, and that Eleanor left you this land for a reason." "What reason?" "I am sorry." Mabel moved toward the door. "I have already said too much. Just do not give up, no matter what they do to you. Your mother would have wanted you to fight." She disappeared into the storm before Aisha could stop her. The next morning, Aisha walked to the town library. It was a small building, barely larger than a shed, but it had a computer with internet access. The librarian glared at her when she entered, but did not tell her to leave. Aisha typed Whitmore Holdings into the search bar and began to read. The company was founded by a man named Richard Whitmore, a real estate developer who had built a fortune buying up rural land and turning it into commercial properties. His net worth was estimated at over $2 billion. He owned half the county and had plans to develop the other half. But buried in an old news article from 10 years ago, Aisha found something interesting. Richard Whitmore had removed his own mother, Eleanor Whitmore, from the company's board of directors. The official reason was personal differences. The unofficial reason, according to anonymous sources, was that Eleanor had opposed her son's plans to develop protected land. Eleanor had spent the last decade of her life living in seclusion. She had no public presence, no social media, no photographs after a certain date. It was like she had vanished. Aisha printed out everything she could find and walked back to the Quonset hut. The pieces were starting to come together, but she was still missing something. Something important. That night she began to search the property. She started with the outside, checking the foundation of the hut, the ground around it, anything that looked unusual. After 3 hours, she found it. A patch of dirt near the back of the structure that was slightly raised, as if something had been buried there. Aisha dug with her bare hands. 6 inches down her fingers hit metal. She pulled out a rusted lockbox, small enough to carry with one hand. The lock had corroded away and the lid came off easily. Inside was a stack of papers, a handwritten letter and a folded map. Aisha brought everything inside and spread it out on the floor. The papers were legal documents, property deeds, and geological surveys dating back decades. The map showed the region around her land with a large blue circle drawn in the center. The words "primary aquifer" were written next to it in faded ink. Her land was sitting on top of an underground water source, the only one in 50 miles. Aisha unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant, but shaky, the letters of someone old and sick. "Dear Aisha," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have succeeded and you are finally home." The letter told her everything. Eleanor Whitmore had known Lorraine Carter. She had loved her. And when her son Richard had thrown Lorraine out into the winter cold for getting pregnant, Eleanor had never forgiven herself for not stopping him.